Good evening, everyone. If you're here in London, good morning, good afternoon. If you're joining us online from somewhere else, I'm Sara Pantuliano, I'm the Chief Executive at ODI, and I'm so delighted to see so many familiar faces in this room, but above all, to have with us Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, the man that needs no introduction, but I will introduce him, of course. When I heard that Mark was about to finish his tenure as the president at the Open Societies Foundation, I thought, well, what a perfect opportunity to grab him and hear his reflections from these few years at OSF and the world of philanthropy, but also more generally about the big challenges that we are facing today, the big global challenges that we are all grappling with, and how the development sector can still, if a sector still exists, can deal with it. And it's great to have Mark talk about it, because Mark's tenure at OSF, I think, has been really marked by an unwavering commitment to advancing social justice, fostering open societies, and really championing human rights worldwide, as you've always done in your career. And your career is long, and it spans a huge array of different roles, both very senior roles at the United Nations and the World Bank, and of course as a British minister, and always leading incredible initiatives from spearheading the promotion of the Millennium Development Goals to the big reform agendas at the World Bank and the UNDP. And I remember those very well, because I was at the receiving end of his reforms at UNDP, in UNDP Sudan, while he was dreaming the big stuff with Europe. But no, they were absolutely needed, no question. But Mark's dedication to conflict prevention, to issues related to war and violence, also led him to found the International Crisis Group in the wake of big crises in Rwanda and in Somalia. And more recently has been chairing Best Britain, that is really focused on engagement between Great Britain and the EU. Everyone for the easy conversations, Mark. And carrying on, doing academic work at Chatham House and Oxford. Of course, you've been honored for your contributions, and I think that means that we really have the privilege of hearing, the reflections from such an incredible vantage point in this point in your career on what you have done at the helm of an important philanthropy. There are a lot of expectations. People think that this is a special moment for philanthropists. We have to add more chairs because you're very popular, clearly. So this is a good moment to reflect with you. So what we're going to do before we get into Mark's legacy at OSF is really have a conversation for 30 minutes between me and Mark, but then I'll open to all of you here and to colleagues online. I'll be taking questions, and then for those who are here in the room, we can also have a moment of celebration next door. So without further ado, Mark, let's get started. If you look back at your on your leadership at OSF, what are the key lessons that you really would like to share with other philanthropists? And I see a few leaders of philanthropies in the room and beyond. I mean, there is a lot of expectations about trust-based philanthropy, potentially bringing a new paradigm for the development space. Is that how you see it?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and it's great that you've asked me to do this, and you and I have been friends and colleagues for a long, long time, so I'm thrilled that we're talking like this. I mean, I suppose the one thing I'd say is, having spent years at the UN and knowing it well as you do, you with these organizations, whether it's a foundation or the UN or the British government, you kind of go through three phases. First, you're a student of it, then you wake up one day and find you're actually working for it. And then there is the long period of reflection afterwards, when you actually understood what it all meant. And so I think my period of foundation reflection still lies ahead. And so the answer is a sort of intermediate answer of what I think now, but I can already, as I start to sort of separate from OSF, sort of feel my sort of instincts moving on a bit as to the role of foundations. But OSF is naturally, because of George Soros, its founder, a sort of anti-establishment foundation to the extent that you can have an anti-establishment foundation. There's a bit of a sort of contradiction almost in the term, because foundations have tended historically to be very much products of their times. I think we have a generation of particularly American foundations, Rockefeller and Ford, who and Carnegie, whose founders were the large part Christian white gentlemen who felt that the role of foundations was to sort of give back, not to challenge the system. It was a system that had made them rich and which they were fully signed up to and were leading members of, but they had a sort of charitable instinct to sort of help those who had not, the system hadn't done well by. So, a ton of stuff into sort of education, health for poor people, etc. And, but if you step back, in a way their role was to sort of sustain the system as it was, to, address some of the pressure and pain points, but not to challenge it. And then I think we entered a period more recently when, philanthropy is both OSF, and I see Joe here, and Gates is another clear example, where our leaders, extraordinary individuals who are very determined to give back, but, to at the same time demand progress, whether it was Gates in health or us in human rights, it sort of evoked a lot of sort of backlash suspicion. What are these large private fortunes doing, telling us what to do? And, there's been a, really profound reaction to that on both the right and the left in many countries. Now, in our case, and I think I probably speak for Joe and Gates and as well in saying this, and others, we've increasingly felt that backlash, constitutes such a threat to the values we believe in, that it's not enough anymore to just, sort of counter it by saying, well, look, we've got a trust-based model where, it's our grantees who we're trusting to spend money, so don't worry about whether our fortune is legitimate or not. Look at the grantees and what they do. And so for us, after the tragedies of recent years in America, a lot of money into Black Lives Matter and groups of that kind, and the same internationally. But, we've increasingly under my period as president saying, but, you can fund all these fantastic organizations, but you've got to have a bigger strategic game plan than that, because the values which you care about of open society in our case, and human rights, liberal democracy, respect for the rule of law, are under such sort of profound threat that it's not enough to just fund a lot of civil society organizations to do their own thing. You need a more strategic philanthropy. And, so we've clearly moved towards that, while recognizing that it is going to provoke questions and criticisms and doubts amongst people about, are we throwing our weight around again? Are we again returning to being, if you like, strategic threats to the contemporary societal organization? And here I just one last point, and this is where, I think even as one moves on and looks back, one starts to sort of wonder whether one had it quite right. I'm very, very struck that, during the Gilded Age, which in America, the last period of this sort of runaway out of control, fortune making and the inequality that arose on the back of it, the foundations tried to fill some of that gap, to deal with some of that inequality. And I'm now talking again about the sort of Rockefellers and Fords. But then Roosevelt got elected president and basically pushed them aside and said, this is the job of government, to deal with this inequality. And I suspect we may see something similar happen now. Whoever gets elected president of the US, or, assuming that we have a Labour government here, but I'm not sure it's a right or left issue. I think we're getting to a profound enough moment of polycrisis, to use the phrase of the day, that this idea that somehow foundations can fix the problem, which was this default view during the Gilded Age, where you could have Herbert Hoover as president, but it was okay because Rockefeller and Ford were dealing with education for poor people. That formula simply doesn't hold, because the level of inequality, the level of societal stress and breakdown is just too great for that. And, I think in that sense, to use an analogy of the Russian Revolution, we're the Kerenskys, but the real revolutionaries follow. And I think, we are going to enter a period where foundations are going to be somewhat eclipsed, because people are going to say, nice lot of people, but simply not big enough, not accountable enough, not systemic enough to deal with what's going wrong with our countries.
That's interesting, and I won't, I'll come back to the relation between philanthropies and public spending, and perhaps also some of the tensions you're alluding to between those who lead philanthropies and those who put the money, make the philanthropy. But you have been able to team up. You mentioned Joe Gates. There are other philanthropies in the room with whom you've teamed up. Big philanthropies. They've really launched important initiatives. Think about Bridgetown or the new Global Financial Pact in Paris. So there is clearly something that allows you to come together and to push for some systemic change. I mean, what makes philanthropies able to work this way?
I think that particular thing where the philanthropies came together on what we call the sort of, a global alliance, and, the main actors and movers in it were ourselves, Gates, Rockefeller, Ford, and SIF, so another UK philanthropy. But I think, there were two enabling conditions. One was, it was all about the response to COVID, which was Herbert Hoover-like at a global scale. It was too little to address the scale of the global crisis. It needed its own sort of New Deal solution. And in the same way that foundations made up the space until Roosevelt became president, I think there was this similar space where, in truth, the main actor was Gates, but where, there was a sort of tacit agreement to have us a little bit more in the front line, because we weren't the same big public health spender that Gates was. But, we felt human rights was on the line in this crisis too. The right of access to basic medicines was under threat, in this case, vaccines. So, so there was this moment where governments were simply not rising to the occasion that we felt we could fill. And there was second, a very happy kind of sort of coincidence of leadership in that, I'd actually been chairman of the SIF board earlier. Mark Sussman, my counterpart at Gates, started his career in this world working for me. And Raj Shah, the president of Rockefeller, started his career working with Mark Sussman at Gates. So, we were a sort of...
That doesn't sound very healthy, but carry on.
So there was we were a very close-knit group of people who cared deeply about development. It was very unusual to have us at the leadership role of the major foundations coincidentally at the same time. And, so I think it was both tragic opportunity of government failure and then a group of individuals who knew each other well and said, let's do something.
I mean, a lot of us reflected, around Paris, how extraordinary it was that a G7 government was happy for philanthropists to come in and actually, foot quite a bit of the bill. That to me speaks to a bigger problem in terms of, the flaws that we see in public finance and the lack of attention, or prioritization of key priorities on the climate side, on the humanitarian side. But many argue that there is still a role for philanthropy to play in this space, even though, as you say, it is really for governments, first and foremost. What is the right balance?
Well, I think you have to have, on the philanthropy side, a sort of deep and disciplined view of the role of the capital you provide, what you can do and what you can't do. And I use the term inside OSF of patient and urgent capital. Patient capital because we don't have to face an electorate. We've just got our board to deal with, and on a good day they're more patient and long term than an electorate. So we can do things, for a long time if that's what it takes to get a change to happen. Urgent because we also have the ability that so many governments don't have of putting up money quickly to do something. But what we don't, so we have patient and urgent, and therefore, if you like, smart capital, but we don't have lots of capital. And, it is worth quantifying that, because at the moment there is this tendency, because ODA is in such a sort of flat period at best, and when you back out the money that's being spent in donor countries on refugee resettlement costs, in fact, I'm sure ODI shows the numbers declining.
Totally.
And so, in that environment, the sort of foundations have become this sort of default place to go. They'll bail us out. And there's often just a complete mismatch of expectation and resources. So, Gates is very large. It spends 7 billion, rising, I think, Joe, to 8 billion or something this year. We and Wellcome are the two next largest, each of us spending north of $1 billion a year. But just to quantify that is the size of Czechoslovakian ODA, or Czech ODA rather, and twice the size of Luxembourg's ODA. But it's a fraction really of the needs. So you see assessments of climate financing needs, and the people here are expert on it. And people talk 6 trillion a year, or 2 or 3 trillion, and these numbers. And when we're talking those numbers, you're talking 2 or 3%, or it's up to 6% of global GDP. And the foundations are literally a drop in the ocean. And I remember once going to talk to Melinda Gates, long before I was running OSF, and eagerly talking to her about the role of Gates and OSF in the world. And she reminded me very eloquently, we're very small. And so, even when you have the Gateses claiming to be very small, I think it gives you a proper concept of the scale of it. And the reason that, of course, there is this default to us is because the official system is failing. And that again takes you back to my Hoover analogy. It was when the American government simply wasn't spending enough to address the victims of the Great Depression that everybody expected Carnegie and Ford to do it. Well, they couldn't. And again, today, now, our role has got to be helping to pilot the innovative mechanisms and financing tools which allow governments and the mountain of private savings in the world to be leveraged and deployed to address these problems, rather than to think that it's a direct foundation check that can fill the gap.
Enough. I want to pick up on something, as you said earlier. You alluded both to the challenges the public sees with the legitimacy of big philanthropists, particularly to, in a way, shape an agenda, a public agenda. And also, you alluded to tensions between those who endow the philanthropies and leaders of philanthropies. I know we have a lot of leaders of philanthropies, both in the room and online. I'd be really interested to hear your reflection on how you navigate these tensions, both with the public and
I'm not sure I'm the expert, but it is the case, and this and it is challenging because I think families have a very important role in foundations in that they are the keepers of the legacy across generations. And in every foundation, it's proved challenging because you've kind of in a way got to separate management of the foundation from that family guardianship role of the foundation long term. And, you know, for example, now at Ford, Darren Walker, the wonderful president of Ford, has just, you know, in his tenure brought a Ford back onto the board. But they had a sort of 20-year period, I think, where there was no Ford on the board. And, you know, Rockefeller doesn't really, the Rockefeller Foundation doesn't have strong Rockefeller presence, but the Rockefeller brothers is very much where the family, or large numbers of the Rockefeller family, are still represented. And you know, so people have struggled with this. And of course it goes, you know, to the heart of the legitimacy issue, because, you know, I think, you know, thoughtful original donors sort of recognize that their children won't necessarily want to spend their time running dad or mum's foundation. You know, they hopefully will have clear career ambitions of their own. And yet, you know, it's easily a very comfortable life because, you know, lots of money to spend, go to see interesting places, meet interesting people. So, you know, keeping the family role appropriate and devoted to the, you know, securing the long-term future of the foundation while leaving space for managers to manage, you know, I think is a challenge that frankly every foundation faces. And I would add, you know, you've got to separate also between the founder generation and the next one, because whether it was George Soros or Bill Gates or, you know, any of this founder group, you know, they've got very rich by being highly exceptional individuals. And, you know, they will have a highly exceptional view of what the foundation should do. And, you know, in a sense, they are always going to be the leading force in the allocation of their own funding. So this issue of the family, in a sense, is more of a sort of second generation than first generation issue.
Interesting. And we're reflecting on, you know, your experience with philanthropy, but I am in front of the former UN Deputy Secretary General, so I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your views on the Summit of the Future that the UN Secretary General is called for September. I've just come back from New York, and I couldn't really help, you know, come back with a bit of, I don't, if not frustration, actually, at this, you know, being disheartened by what I've heard and seen in terms of the process. You know, this takes place at a moment where global cooperation is incredibly fragmented and challenged, and yet is supposed to be a rallying cry to, you know, bring sort of some new energy into global cooperation. How do you see it? Can you really bring any value?
Sara, you know, you are an optimist. So if you come back from New York down, that sort of says quite a lot before we begin. But look, it is challenging. I mean, you know, more power and, you know, credit to the Secretary General for trying, but you know, there just isn't a mood in New York to do very much, I think. And it's tragic because, you know, obviously the demands on the system have rarely been potentially greater. You again have this polycrisis, which is, you know, a crisis of inequality, of debt, of breakdown of, you know, the response to climate change. I mean, it is, as its name implies, a series of interlinked crises going across, you know, a bunch of things, and everything that happens, whether it is the tragedy in Gaza or, you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, all of these things merely compound by their impact on grain prices, their impact on, you know, political stability and security and et cetera, et cetera. So you've got this sense of a compounding set of crises and, you know, a UN system utterly unable to sort of rise to the occasion. And I think people inside the system feel that as much as people on the outside. And you will have seen from talking to your friends, in many cases my friends too, we know their morale has rarely been lower. So it is really challenging, but I think, but I do think that there's this sort of feast or famine approach to reform at the UN. Everybody either says you need a San Francisco moment, you need to reboot the thing from scratch, or if you can't do that, nothing happens. And in truth, the UN, behind the sort of rather sort of bureaucratic face it presents to the world, has actually been in 80 years of sort of evolution and responding to crises and opportunities as they come along, more than people, I think, recognize and acknowledge. So, I mean, I always cite the example of when I worked in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the then Secretary General came on a field visit and was seeing these massive camps we built on the Thai-Cambodian border, and there was massive logistics operations and staff busying themselves in all directions, and Secretary General looks around bewildered and said, "Nobody ever told me any of this was here." And, it was actually a quite deliberate deceit. It was all run out of Geneva so that New York, which was the sort of epicenter of geopolitical Cold War gridlock, wouldn't know about it, basically. And, I looked similarly when I then went to run UNDP at its illustrious earlier history, providing technical assistance with the specialized agencies to post-colonial independent states, countries which had almost no human capital at all at the point of independence. And along came FAO with a grant from UNDP or UNESCO or WHO, and built ministries of health or education. And so again, the Cold War was raging and the Security Council was as impotent as it is today. But the UN was playing important roles, and I sort of see today around several issues, of which I would sort of say climate, economic coordination as a subset of climate, economic policy coordination, and migration, and possibly the regulation of AI, the kind of issues which people may put aside rivalries and geopolitical competition enough to find a shared way through, just because the stakes are so high. A China, as much as a US, needs the global economy to keep growing. Many countries, south as well as north, are affected by the scaling up of migratory movements as climate, economics, politics, security compound each other to generate every year bigger movements than the previous year. And so, I think there are a few issues which will force their way onto the global agenda and be solved. Whether it will be done through some vast assembly of 192 countries at the UN or a more sort of tailored minilateralism is less clear, I think.
I mean, there may be some brinkmanship right at the end, but all of these issues are there as some of the elements, the chapters of the pact, but they're really struggling, to come together. We'll see what happens in this September. One thing I'm struck by, though, is we've seen a lot of energy coming from the youth. We have had a very strong youth movement for climate. Now we're seeing, the youth occupying universities and streets, demanding justice and peace. Is there a way to channel this tremendous energy that comes from young people, to really push more meaningful reform?
I think there probably is. I mean, I pretty much all my time at the UN, which goes back to when I could credibly count as youth too, as a young P1 at the bottom leg of the system.
We've been there.
You've been there too, and I bet you started at something grander than P1, P2.
I was a GPU.
I claim to have been the only one who's gone the whole way up the system from P1 to Deputy Secretary General. So this role of youth has been, always sort of front and center, but for years it's been a sort of tokenist thing, you know, in the same way you roll in a business leader or something else at the end of a bunch of extraordinarily dull statements by member states, you'd have the youth envoy say something, and, you know, it was empty and tokenistic. And I think, you know, something very profound is happening now. I think it's, you know, and I think the American campuses and our campuses are one place where it's happening, but I think it's already happened in a series of sort of government changes across West Africa and some other places too, where finally in Africa, where the demography is the most skewed of anywhere in the world, with, you know, this young bulge and an aging elite clinging on to power, you're seeing these dramatic moves. And, you know, we are seeing youth, and I think use that term as a foundation head for a moment, you know, we're seeing youth, you know, on the one hand, moving finally to sort of take power, but in many cases doing it through unexpected channels. So, you know, political parties are aging for the most part. I mean, the Tory party here, what has an average age of 65, I think it's membership, and there's not many of them. But you know, but actually, the Chinese Communist Party, and particularly its leadership, is not exactly youthful either. So it's not, and then you have a 77-year-old running against an 81-year-old for president in the US. So you know, there's an age problem, and under it, a youth beginning to surge, but doing it through these unexpected channels, finding political parties alienating, unfriendly, aged, you know, old people dominated, and so going into social movements. So, you know, my guess is the next generation of political leaders in a country like ours will come not out of those characters you see in pubs around Westminster who, you know, are volunteering in MPs' offices or are young staffers in the Tory or Labour Party. I think it'll be out of Extinction Rebellion and a group of, you know, a bunch of other places that activists will move across into party politics. And the challenge is to make them do so. You know, we've just had an election in Senegal, and this is about the only audience in London that probably knows about the election in Senegal, ODI, but not quite. But you people should know about it because it's a really interesting election where, you know, a very well-regarded president got tempted to try and take a third term, you know, got backed off by the level of public protest. But the reason he wanted a third term was all these unwashed youngsters were sort of threatening his legacy. His named candidate was not going to win. And indeed, you know, a 40-year-old tax inspector coming from a social movement has won the presidency. And when he was sworn in, he invited his fellow West African leaders, a number of whom are coup leaders, but young as well. And that crowd in the stadium in Dakar cheered those leaders as they came in, because for them, they were a more representative group of leaders than these old guys claiming to be democratically elected, but in truth, you know, representing a political elite which was self-perpetuating and, you know, exploiting democratic process to continue its rule. And so, you know, we're seeing a youth revolution begin, and I think, you know, let's see what happens in the US. I think it's unlikely, but I don't think it's impossible that the student protests won't necessarily stop with the end of term, and that you may see something going on across the summer, you know, and everybody recognizes the historical, you know, evocative thing of, you know, a Democrat convention in Chicago, you know, with its echoes of 1968. You know, it wasn't a very happy outcome, but you know, I think I really hope we're at a moment where, you know, there is going to be that demographic shift, and we certainly at OSF, for me, it's one of the things I was most keen to see put in place was a large investment in youth leadership development to identify people in social movements and bring them over into the political mainstream, help them move over into the political mainstream to be the next generation of political leaders.
We really need to open to the audience, but one last question. What's next for Mark Malloch-Brown?
Yeah, you know,
A few hundred people for watching online, it's all right.
No. Well, look, no. I mean, you know, just the glory of sort of running something like OSF is it reinforces all your passions. So you end up being passionate about the state of democracy, passionate about the state of multilateralism, you know, passionate about a whole bunch of things. And yet you sort of know that at certain points in your life, you need to remember to specialize a bit. And so while, you know, so, and I think for me, it is actually going to be around trying to make multilateralism work better, despite what we've said about the Summit of the Future, because, you know, there is, you know, a sense that multilateralism is in one ways a guardrail to badly behaved nationalism. Not a very effective one always, but, you know, when you see, you know, the ICC's actions now against Hamas and individuals in the Israeli government, and you saw the ICJ's actions earlier, you know, it's an interesting thing that it's not the political institutions, but the judicial institutions which have, you know, taken this stand. But I think, you know, it's a reminder that, you know, even if we're going to have a very bumpy period at the national level in many countries, hopefully not here, but possibly in the US and large parts of Europe and elsewhere, trying to have a multilateral system that can nevertheless function around some of those priorities I mentioned earlier is not something to be wasted. So actually the first sort of project in my new life that I've sort of signed up to and is to an invitation from the new president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, and Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, to work with a couple of other Global South leaders to curate a global consultation about what these two venerable institutions at 80 should do in the coming decades. How do they get their governance model, their business model, their purpose and mission, their scale and size, you know, sort of reset for this very changed world? I mean, you know, one of my colleagues has unearthed this wonderful fact that the 1944, when the conference of Bretton Woods happened, where these two institutions were formed, not only was it a world where, you know, a huge quarter of the world were under colonial rule or more, and, you know, where you still had systems of, you know, racial slavery and serfdom, you know, across large parts of the global economy, but it was in fact in time closer to the assassination of Lincoln than to today. And so, you know, there is a real moment, I think, for reinvention, but not, you know, I share only one thing with John Maynard Keynes, which is, well, actually two things, a Cambridge degree and a membership of the House of Lords, but there the comparisons stop. And I'm very conscious that it is not my job to sort of write a new plan for these institutions, because the time when a couple of white men could do that, Keynes and his counterpart in the US, Dexter White, is well gone. And it's not that I and the two colleagues who have been asked to do this with me, Sri Mulyani, the finance minister of Indonesia, and Patrick Achi, a former prime minister of Cote d'Ivoire, it's not that even our three brains should be writing this. It's that we have to manage a global conversation which arrives at some sense of direction for these institutions, which enjoys support, you know, across as much of their stakeholders and global community as ever. We're not, you know, we're past the age of top-down tablets. And so it's be a fascinating exercise. And I think a counter exercise to this Summit for the Future, because it's not going to be 192 countries sitting in a room and blocking each other. It's going to be an attempt to get a free-flowing conversation that, you go and talk to people in China, you go and talk to people in Washington, you talk to the private sector, to civil society, to younger people, and you try to distill and curate and find the essence of where people agree and, feed that into the discourse rather than this sort of arid process of 192 people behind state name badges who...
Reading, speaking. Poem.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen a few smiley faces amongst my colleagues that work on MDB reform, so very smart of Ajay and Kristalina too. Yes.
What are they?
Sorry?
What's an MBB for?
MDB, Multilateral Development Bank Reform.
Sorry, I hope there wasn't too much of that jargon.
But yeah, so very, and of course, if in any way ODI can help, we'll be here. Right, let me open to the audience. There'll be a roving mic somewhere. Yes, raise your hand, say who you are, and I can ask also my colleagues to start feeding through the questions from the chat because they're not coming through. For those who are following online, you can put questions in the online box that you see under the chat. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you and listen to you. My name is Orzala Nemat. I'm a research associate here at ODI. My question is regarding the education systems. You very nicely explained the political state of affairs where we are politically in terms of political parties, but I'm interested to know that the vision that you explain in terms of the future of the young leadership coming from the social movements. What worries me looking around, and by the way, I'm originally from Afghanistan and I've worked all my life there. When I'm looking around the young generation, particularly in terms of population of the world and where they are coming from, for example, look at Afghanistan, over 65% of our population is like below the age of 25. So, and that question is not necessarily about only that region, but globally, is the current educational system globally is responding to the kind of key issues that are emerging and the social movements that will produce the young leaders? Yeah. Because whatever material we see through social media and platforms and everything is not really something that gives, at least me, as someone as a student of development studies, a hope that I will see like articulated leaders that will understand and have a deeper understanding of the inequalities and the social challenges. Thank you.
Let me take 3 or 4. Let's see, Nicola here. And, okay, we'll come back to you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Mark, hello. Nicola Reindort from Crisis Action, where we've had the privilege of working together. I've had the privilege of watching you in action in a number of roles. You and the idea of you using your expertise at this moment to invest in rescuing the multilateral vision for the World Bank and the IMF feels like a very worthy focus. I mean, the way that you've described it of holding the ring, what is the nature of the conversation that needs to happen about that is incredibly powerful. For those of us that are focused on looking to the multilateral system around the protection of civilians from conflict and the prevention of how we take ourselves to hell as human beings, you've commented interestingly, in a way I share, how interesting we look to judicial mechanisms right now are the remaining guardrails, as you describe it, from rampant nationalisms. Where do we look, however, and you know the optimist that I am, where do we look and where do we go to rescue the prospect, to not give up on the prospect of more effective multilateral responses to the protection of civilians and prevention of conflict? What is the strategy? What is it we need to be looking to, in your view?
Can you see one from Nicola? Can I have the mic here at the front? Thanks, Mark. And then I'll come back to you behind. I'll go another one. Yes.
Thanks very much, Rob Merrick from the website DevX. I've been asked to ask a question on behalf of a colleague, so I hope I get this right, which is about the restructuring at OSF, and I think a belief that, a feeling that it's left many perhaps smaller community organisations in difficult position. The example was mentioned of LGBTQ groups in Africa. So can I ask, do you share any of that concern that there are groups left in perhaps tenuous positions by the restructuring, or do you think that steps have been taken to mitigate that?
So I take one last one, then I'll do another round.
My name's Kate Clark. Really nice to hear you. I'm from professionally from the Afghanistan Analyst Network. We're a research organisation based in Kabul. But I actually have quite a parochial question, which is about the Labour government, which may yet come into power later this year. You were involved in the last one. Do you have hopes for them to do better on aid, development, social equality? And if so, where do you think they might be going with that? I mean, we've just heard Gordon Brown speak very eloquently about poverty, particularly child poverty, in a way that we haven't really heard from the current crop of Labour leaders. I know it's different when you're out of power than in power, but I welcome your thoughts.
Let's start with these. I've got a few more also online, but
Well, and I'll try and be quicker than I have been in the answers earlier. So first on the education one, I think it's a really important point because I think, as, somebody deeply committed to the Open Society values and, the very name Open Society came from George Soros's fascination with Karl Popper and core to Karl Popper's philosophy was, the concept of the critical clash of ideas. And, I do think that while I spoke earlier to the optimistic side of youth leadership and, bringing them from social movements into political leadership, there is a real vulnerability, and that is around critical thinking on sort of Western, but campuses everywhere, actually. And I think, I think we really have to look at ourselves hard and realize that, this movement to show such profound respect to the well-being of every category of students around, their reluctance to hear hard challenge. I grew up, like probably many people in this room, with my father telling me after, some particularly bad day at primary school, sticks and stones may break your bones, words can do no harm, or whatever. And, we need to be careful because, one does see, particularly, I think, on US campuses, a strange move towards a level of self-censorship of the debate of ideas, which, is leaving students, without, so if you take, and I mean, I know this is very sensitive and I'll probably regret saying it, but to live up to my own thing about honest speech, it's very interesting at Columbia, for example, at the moment where Hillary Clinton teaches. Hillary has publicly, in a number of different fora, complained about the level of knowledge of the students she's engaged with, who are largely at SEPA, the graduate school there, public policy and graduate school around the Middle East. And, behind it, the intent of many of them to appear to look at Israel entirely through the lens of white colonialism. And, that just doesn't do justice to the complexity of how Israel got to be there. Whatever your view, and I and Hillary, like me, who, both come, as many others do, from a generation, when I was 18 years old, my great hope was to go and spend my gap year working on a kibbutz. I didn't, but, we were a generation who bought into the sort of idealism of the sort of socialist experiment of Golda Meir and the founders' Israel. And, that vision is totally flawed too. But, at least one's sort of grown up through the history of the country. One's understood the aspirations and ambitions. One's seen how many of them have got thwarted and gone awry. But, to simply reduce Israel to a expression of white colonialism just simply doesn't do justice to the history. And so, there is a problem. I mean, there is a problem, I think, about the sort of the quality of debate, and you look at what's been happening on American campuses, and it is two sides shouting at each other. It is not an engagement to try and find common ground and hear each other's point of view. So I think there is a real challenge that has to be faced. On the point about civilians, Nicola, I actually think this is another area where there is the possibility of some movement, because I think, while it's been subjected to double standards where, the same countries that condemned Russia for the level of Ukrainian casualties, civilian casualties, and a campaign which more than ever is about just bombing civilian infrastructure to prevail, have been in many cases not so quick to condemn similar casualties in Gaza. They are now doing so because it's become so egregious. But, I think from the lessons of that is going to emerge a view that states have borrowed the tactics of terrorism, basically. They've decided civilian targets are relatively unprotected, low cost, and yet can send a huge political signal. And, the deterioration from, earlier state conduct of war to where we are now is dramatic. And I think if ever there was a place where, I think a concerted civil society human rights campaign could over time make and prevail in restoring, how civilians are treated during conflict, I think it's that. On the LGBT point, which I'm very aware, you strike, at a sensitive thing, because, the last thing we want to do is leave any beleaguered human rights defenders, without resources. And, we've always been conscious as OSF that there are groups of organizations for whom we are often almost the only funder. But just because for all sorts of reasons, they are difficult groups to reach. I think it is worth saying that for those groups in Africa, they've got at the moment a double problem. One, which, we can't do much about, which is really drastic laws in Ghana, Uganda, elsewhere, and, which have meant we've tried everything we can by way of funding to prevent that. We are in our Africa program going through a restructuring and a redesign and a repurposing of it. I would be, and in a sense it's for my successors to speak to it, and my successor president is herself a Kenyan Asian woman, so, with a long human rights background, so I would be, astonished if we were to forego that funding, but I can't, speak for what her priorities will be in this area. But, look, these are the kinds of issues and groups we hold very dear.
There was one last question.
Labour Party, sorry, I was looking at it. I couldn't read my own handwriting. Look, I think, I think all of us who, at one level are thrilled to see after this, long period of, deterioration of so many aspects of, British life, its infrastructure, quality of its health systems, you name it. Are desperate to see a government which will have a long-term vision to restore these things. But you've put your finger on it. It's a government which believes that, or a government in waiting which believes that, it is in a sense, it's sort of seems to be a bit guilty of leaving the Tories to lose the election rather than proactively, winning it. And I think many of us would love to see, a clearer public articulation of, a vision, a 10-year vision for rebuilding Britain. And that would include rebuilding Britain in the world and our reputation as a soft power leader and ODA leader, etc. I think we are caught in this two-party conspiracy where for very sort of good electoral political campaign reasons, neither side wants to own up to the financial nightmare which is going to follow this election. The Tories, because it would be an admission of the costs of a decade or more of bad government. Labour, because it will invite the immediate question, well, who are you going to tax to pay for it? And so there is this strange conspiracy of silence across the two parties. And, you know, the IMF are here today delivering their annual health warning on the UK economy. And, you know, the early press reports this morning showed that they've identified a 30 billion funding gap opening up from about 2026 and then I suspect growing annually. And, you know, neither party wants to hear that, you know, and, you know, the risk for Labour is by not acknowledging it and not coming up with the right kind of plan to address it, it then lacks the clear mandate for the very difficult decisions and choices that are going to need to be made after an election. So, you know, there's 6 months to go, still time for some honesty.
Mark, we're pretty much at time, but I know there are a lot of other questions. I don't know if you are okay to go over, but, you know, 5 minutes. I'll take one from online, one from this side and one from that side, to be fair, not to everyone who's concentrated in the middle. I know you've been waiting for it. I'll take you as well. Okay, so Abigail Connolly from Safer World asks, what do you think the role of foundations should be in the future, particularly in the light of what you're noticing about young people and social movements? Should family foundations now be more proactive in trying to push for system change? And Mike here, because I had said yes before.
Thank you, Sarah. Adrian Lovett, Development Initiatives. Mark, I was just wanting to ask you about leadership and the insights that you have gathered, both as a leader and observing other leaders, and perhaps to put a point on it, which leader that you've observed or worked alongside has most surprised you? For better or worse?
And Michael, over there.
Thank you, Mark, for a very stimulating start of a conversation. And probably this question should have been asked when you were just starting at OSF rather than afterwards. I teach.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Michael Jacobs. I'm a visiting fellow here, and I teach at Sheffield University, where my experience of young people is less than they are just shouting at one another, as that they don't know anything, because they have such unreliable sources of information. So we obviously try and teach them things, and after they go through us, they know a bit more. But they come with a mixture, a mishmash of stuff that comes through their social media feeds. They don't read newspapers, even online, and so they don't have either the editorial efforts of newspapers or the curation of different stories that a newspaper provides, because even if you read one online. And the bigger picture of this, so you say that multilateralism is a kind of the guardrail against rampant nationalisms. The rampant nationalisms are being fed very deliberately by particular powers. It's not a kind of just a spontaneous thing from below, and they are corrosive of all kinds of values. I mean, almost all solidaristic values are corroded by the rampant ethno-nationalism that we see, and a lot of that is fed through the social media. So I wondered, my question is, at OSF, which is the Open Societies Foundation, so it's not just a development foundation and so on, were you looking at media companies, and the parasites who are now stripping them, who are the social media digital platforms, taking all the funding away from journalism through newspapers, and now not even giving you access directly to the journalism? They just do it through their digest and so on. Is this something you looked at? Is it something that the foundation should be bigger in? Because this is the kind of meta problem that faces many of our individual issues on development, climate, human rights, and so on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. And last question. Was a big support for your question. There's no question on this side, so I'll come to you.
Thank you. Very quickly, Marta also visiting senior fellow here and other things, and we've met a couple of times, work on migration for many years. But my question actually builds on this last one. I want to connect what you said earlier on about foundations and then this reflection on youth, which is that I also think that is very frustrating when you just have the tokenistic young person standing up in the multilateral system. So is when there is a tokenistic mayor, for that matter, or the tokenistic something else that is outside sort of the nation state systems that the multilateral system serves. And so given what you said about the fact that foundations are small and the money is not enough, could they shift a little bit their ways of working? So rather than just funding projects or initiatives, they could actually more practically find alliances outside of the multilateral system so that the youth, the media, the private sector that frankly doesn't know what to do with the multilateral system and the UN, or the mayors, I work with a lot of them, and there is incredible energies in cities, so they can actually create some coalitions for change. And maybe some of that money that foundations have will actually be quite a lot if invested in creating coalitions. Thanks.
Thanks, Marta.
Well, all really good points. I mean, starting with Abigail online about the, role of family foundations. Yes, I think it is about investing in systemic change. And, the extent to which foundations, to repeat a point earlier, retain and build legitimacy, depends on, I think, above all else, impact. There's always going to be questioning of where their money's come from. But, if they show themselves to be a force for real change, I mean, Rockefeller and Ford, in a sense, there was life before the Green Revolution and there was life after. As the Green Revolution has come under criticism, there's maybe a third phase of life. But the point is, that here were two foundations which over a sustained period of time, together, to go to this point about collaboration, changed the face of agriculture in the subcontinent in a way which then the World Bank and others picked up on. Now, as I say, a lot of subsequent criticism about the actual model, and was it too fertilizer dependent, etc. But it was an act of social change which transformed incomes across, rural India and India's general development prospects. So I think, it goes to this point that yes, there's plenty of room for collaboration too. But again, even when we put our resources together, we're small. This is, and we have done at OSF, when I started, we were doing a lot with mayors, and frankly, and it's hugely, you're right, hugely dynamic group. But what I realized was there are a lot of mayors out there, and our money was getting more and more small and dispersed, and I just felt it wasn't making enough difference. So I'm not very popular with mayors because we're doing less with them, not because I don't think they're a vital level of change. I mean, if I was to bet on levels of change, mayors and multilateral would probably come ahead of national leaders in my particular, firmament of things. The leadership point, Adrian, I mean, you kind of know what I'm going to say. It's a sort of, because I'm going to say Kofi Annan as one leader. I'm sort of, I'm hopeless. I mean, I'm very predictable about this. No, he did surprise me actually, because I'd known him when he was head of human resources at UNHCR, and to be head of human resources anywhere is not necessarily, as many of us have wrestled with our HR colleagues over the years and begged them for another day's leave or whatever. We don't necessarily expect them to be the most expansive, generous, brilliant statesmen of world leaders at the end. So, and I think more than me being surprised, because I always knew the depth of his humanity and decency and his passion and vision about what he was doing. So you're right, I wasn't really that surprised. But, member states were hell of surprised. They didn't realize at all what they just appointed. And so, that's in a way the challenge. But, I think on the other side of the ledger, what I have seen is so many leaders, time after time, just continually to double down on failure. I spent a decade of my life, which we've not touched on tonight, as a political advisor and political consultant to all sorts of leaders. And whether it was the spectacular way some of them chose to lose elections, or the equally spectacular way they burned out in government, the greatest trait was this failure to see what was wrong. And I remember just there have been so many presidencias, particularly in Latin America, where I glumly go down because my candidate, having won brilliant re-election, was now busy burning it up as president. And each time I would take a bet with my colleagues before we went into the room, you wait, he's going to blame it on the press. And, sure enough, the press don't understand me. The press, and Joe Biden in today's America, apparently you go into his White House, press don't understand me. New York Times doesn't understand what I'm doing. Well, when a Democratic president thinks that the New York Times is not on his side, there's a problem. So, I've just seen just generation after generation of politicians just get closed down by being in power and fail to understand what's happening to them and how they need to reset and open their thinking and hear other points of view. So let me go to Michael's point about the media. And I'm very glad now to be able to see that I have the head of OSF's media program, Mary Fitzgerald, here, who was one of my best ever recruits to OSF. I hope that doesn't condemn your future, but because we are trying to. We completely believe what you have said, and when I described multilateralism, it was as a guardrail because I completely, I'm just saying multilateralism is something where I feel I personally can make a continuing impact. But I completely agree that if you're looking at scaling the threats to a decent liberal order, you'd put the social media and the collapse of traditional media right at the top of your list. And so, we are trying to do a number of things. One, we've always been active around the regulation of privacy and personal information, etc. But more significantly, Mary came in to head a media program, which, includes at the one level a lot of quite small support to innovative media operations, across the developing world. Some of them very well-known ones, but who I won't risk their proprietors and publishers spending a day in jail by naming them. But we've really been at the sharp edge of that. But the other thing we've done, which has been my personal hobby horse, has been to say, you simply cannot have a sustainable media sector globally, which has to depend on foundation grants. You've got to find new financially sustainable economic models. So through our endowment, we are 40% owners of one of the US's most successful podcast companies. We are shortly going to be the principal owners of the third biggest network of radio stations in the US. We own one or two strange newspapers in strange places around the same argument of trying to protect local news, because we've decided that we should use our investment power to try and build a plausible, sustainable media sector as well. And so, I'm completely with you. There is, the only thing I would say is that, for example, there's been a real surge of interest amongst US foundations in local media, local newspapers. We've been a little bit more circumspect than the rest because, we're constantly looking at, well, okay, but what does that mean for media in the Philippines or media in Brazil? We don't want to plow everything into the US end. And yes, local media is really important, but, local print media in this case, but what about radio? What about, actually an online media that is user-friendly and around high-quality news? So we've tried to have a kind of, I hope, a more flexible, imaginative response, but it is all about addressing your point, which is providing high-quality, properly sourced information to people.
Mark, thank you so much. It's been a privilege listening to you, to your reflection on not just philanthropy, but really how to tackle the very wicked challenges that we are facing at the moment. Clearly, we'll have to do another conversation, your political advisory phase insights, which sound really intriguing. Maybe we'll do a off the record one on that one. It sounds really interesting. But I'm really thrilled, I and many others, I'm sure, to hear about what you're about to embark upon, because we couldn't think of anyone better to contribute to rethinking the Bretton Woods institutions. And of course, if ODI can help in any way, you know that we are here. Thank you to everyone online who's been here today. Thank you to all of you. For those who are here, we can carry on next door over a glass of wine, and you can keep asking Mark questions, but not too many. He's also allowed to relax over a glass of wine. But please join me in thanking Lord Mark Malloch-Brown very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.